Good evening, good afternoon, and perhaps good morning. My name is Amy Hunter. I am the Literary Programs and Marketing Manager at the Mercantile Library in Cincinnati, Ohio, and welcome to The Case for Cities, The Moving City. This is our first conversation in this series in 2021. We started in September. It's a total of 11 in the series, and each and every one has been fantastic. If this is your first one, you can go back to watch all of them. In the top left of your screen where it says schedule session 5 of 11, if you hit the more button, you can go back and watch as many as you like. So, and people are already, thank you for sharing where you're watching from in the chat. We appreciate that. Very quickly, in the middle of your screen at the bottom, there's a button that says ask a question. For questions, please ask them there. And Vikas Mehta, our moderator for the evening, will get to the Q&A from that section. If you have questions about the library, you can email me directly or at ahunter@mercantilelibrary.com, or just check out our website. And with that, I will hand it over to Vikas, and thanks everyone, and enjoy the program.
Thank you, Amy. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our fifth conversation in the series that makes the case for cities. My name is Vikas Mehta, and I'm a professor of urban design at the School of Planning at the University of Cincinnati. The Case for Cities conversations are produced by the School of Planning and are made possible by a very generous grant from the Hale Foundation. Online hosting is provided by the Mercantile Library of Cincinnati, and there's additional support for a future publication and exhibition that is provided by North American Properties, the Western and Southern Financial Group, and the Orville Simpson Center for Urban Futures at DAAP, the University of Cincinnati. In our previous conversations last year, we talked about the potential of cities as places of choices and places of justice, and the networks offered only by urban life, where innovation, access to opportunities, a high quality of life, and diverse cultures can emerge and thrive. Over the next several months, in our continuing conversations with thought leaders, academics, professionals, and community leaders, we will bring new perspectives on how housing, food, nature, culture, and philanthropy can make our cities just and desirable. With these conversations, we will continue to showcase the immense value of cities, to inspire and to find ways to advance and improve cities, large and small, including Cincinnati and cities like it. In this time of the pandemic, I'm sure you've witnessed the anti-urban sentiment in the media, and this has been going on for months. As I noted in my introduction in the October session last year, those who have pointed to density of cities as the culprit have missed the point. In fact, quite the opposite. Looking at the world shows us that this is a problem not of density and cities, but of inequities and behavior. Inequities of resources and opportunity in our society, and behavior that is misguided by lack of responsibility and leadership. Let's hope that with the change now, we will have some change in behavior and change in leadership. But we have to remember that we all have a part to play in this change. Today's conversation, The Moving City, is about mobility and transportation, and about its relationship to the social, political, and economic aspects of cities. Studies of the social, economic, and the spatial inform us that the quality of flows and the space of flows is fundamental to the quality of networks that is a distinctive characteristic of cities. Good access is fundamental for people to reap the benefits of the numerous social and economic opportunities that cities offer. And quite literally, a city that is walkable, bikeable for all, and well connected by transit provides not only efficiency but equity, while also bringing diverse groups together in a shared space of mobility. Places that consider good mobility as a public good are more equitable, they are more productive, and are able to deliver a better urban experience to residents, and they become more attractive as places of choice for newcomers. Tonight, in this fifth conversation of the series, The Moving City, Equitable and Sustainable Transportation, we are joined with two leading thinkers on mobility and transportation, Dr. Anastasia Loukaitou-Sideris and Dr. Drusilla Van Hengel. As all of our speakers in the series, they too deeply care for and believe in cities as a way toward an equitable, resilient, and prosperous future. Bringing very different perspectives, they will talk about the role of mobility and transportation in cities. During the second half, after their presentations, I will ask them about the challenges and opportunities regarding transportation in cities like Cincinnati. Then we will open it up to audience questions, which you would have posted in the chat section. And again, please post your questions in the Ask a Question feature, which is at the bottom of Crowdcast. I encourage you to vote on the questions that you'd like to hear answered. And finally, at 9 p.m., we will leave you with some new inspiration. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Anastasia Loukaitou-Sideris, Associate Dean of the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs, a distinguished professor of urban planning, and a core faculty of the UCLA Urban Humanities Initiative. Anastasia's research focuses on the public environment of the city, its physical manifestation, representation, aesthetics, social meaning, and impact on the urban resident. This includes documentation and analysis of the social and physical changes that have occurred in the public realm, cultural determinants of design and planning and their implication for public policy, quality of life issues for inner city residents, transit security, urban design, land use, and transportation issues. She has served as a consultant to the Transportation Research Board, Federal Highway Administration, LA Metro, Southern California Association of Governments, and many, many more, on issues of urban design, open space development, land use, and transportation. She has been commissioned to author research papers by the National Academies and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Anastasia has published extensively on these topics, and only some of her recent books include Transit-Oriented Displacement or Community Divided, New Companion to Urban Design, Transit Crime and Sexual Violence in Cities, and Urban Humanities, New Practices for Reimagining the City. Anastasia, welcome.
Well, thank you, Vikas, for this introduction. And I also want to thank the School of Planning for hosting the event and, of course, the library. I want to try to share my screen. Give me 1 minute. Can you see it? Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Oops. Let me try again. It had no, okay. Let me see. How about now?
Not yet.
We tried before, and
It worked perfectly.
Share screen.
And then you have to choose the app or a web page.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm doing.
There we go.
You can see it now.
Yes.
You can. Okay, fantastic. Okay, sorry about this mishap. So I'm going to draw from a very recent work that actually will appear as a chapter in a new book with a couple of my colleagues. we're working on that we call Just Urban Design. And the title of my talk is The Right to Walk in the Neighborhood. And I will have to start with Henri Lefebvre, who has described the right to the city as a demand for a transformed and renewed access to urban life. And I view physical mobility, which is the ability to move from one place to another smoothly, quickly, and without impediment, as a right to the city. It relates to accessibility, which gives us the ability to access and take advantage of physical amenities in the city, such as the parks, the supermarkets, the schools, but also economic opportunities, such as jobs. And both mobility and accessibility are essential for our quality of life. And I would argue also for the fulfillment of utilitarian, psychosocial, and health needs. But the mobility of certain groups in the city, and I'm talking about women, children, older adults, minority groups, is often compromised because of cultural, economic, social, and environmental factors. Let's take the example of women. In most cultures, they're the primary caregivers. They're mostly responsible for household and domestic chores. This affects their mobility, affects the time they have, affects their travel patterns. Transportation planners talk about trip chaining to indicate how women often have to take many short trips that are often related to domestic chores, trips to the kids' school, trips to the supermarket. This may prevent them for doing or for taking other trips that they may want to take. More recently, I studied harassment in transit environments. And I published a book recently, a couple of months ago, that we looked into 18 cities around the world. We were not surprised to see that women were more likely to be victimized by sexual harassment in all these cities, which constrained their mobility. It led to avoidance of walking, cycling, even the use of public transit for some of them. Children represent another group that has constrained mobility because often of parental fears of stranger danger and dangers from traffic. Actually, I would argue that children in this generation have less independent mobility than a generation ago, or our generation, or the generation of grandparents. I remember asking in a number of talks, how many of you walk to school? And a number of hands would go up. And when I would ask people, how many of you allow your kids to walk to school? There are quite fewer hands. We can also talk about other groups with constrained mobility, such as low-income minority groups who do not own cars, who may live in high-crime neighborhoods. But today, I wish to focus on older adults for two reasons. One, because at least before COVID, people over 65 represented the fastest growing age group in the United States, and yet US cities are not planned and designed to be age-friendly. And second, because the current pandemic has been particularly brutal for older adults in terms of morbidity, but also for those who have survived, as it has really almost completely made them lose their mobility out of fear for their lives. So my talk will examine one particular form of mobility, which is walking. And walking is the most common form for mobility for elders who live in urban settings, who may not own a car or can no longer drive. Walking is also the most accessible form of physical activity for older adults. And there have been a number of studies that associate walking and physical activity with particular aspects of the built environment. And this is what I'm trying to show in the slide that shows on the left column all these different design elements of the built environment and how and all of these are shown to affect walkability, the feelings of safety, feelings of comfort, convenience, as well as the aesthetics. And all these affect walking. And we also know from studies that walking not only affects the physical health of older and younger adults, but also the psychological health, mental health. We also know that the proximity of destinations to older adults residents enables walking. That's something that we are expecting. So the right to the city, the right to walking, can only be enjoyed by older adults if their neighborhood sidewalks are designed to be pedestrian friendly and are designed to be inclusive for them. So I'm going to report on a study of older adults who live in a typical Los Angeles inner city neighborhood. It is called Westlake. You can see them in the black color in the map. It is about less than 2 miles west of downtown Los Angeles. And I used in the study a methodology that was first introduced by Kevin Lynch. People who are in urban design know that Kevin Lynch is a pioneering figure of urban design. Kevin Lynch accompanied residents in the city to walks around the block. And I myself, along with my students, I accompanied 11 older residents of Westlake and asked them to explain in their own voices their walking experience around their block. My objective was to uncover through their eyes the environmental, social, and traffic impediments that obstruct their walks and make inner city sidewalks not inclusive public spaces, and to consider design interventions that can make these inner city sidewalks more inclusive public spaces. The study uncovered a wealth of information about these impediments that I'm going to present, drawing from this everyday reality and the extraordinary circumstances during the pandemic. I will discuss how to achieve inclusive sidewalks for older adults through design and planning. I should also note that the majority of studies on older adult mobility rely on aggregate data and statistical associations. However, the secondary data that come from statewide or citywide or even national household travel surveys can reveal aggregate travel patterns, but cannot convey the individual experiences while making a trip in one's neighborhood. And that's where I found Kevin Lynch's methodology very useful. So just a couple of words about this study of Lynch. In 1959, Lynch, with his collaborator, Malcolm Rifkin, took a few individuals around the city block in Boston and recorded and analyzed later their comments on what they encountered along their walk. This effort of Lynch was to understand what makes urban form imageable and legible. And indeed, this study was published as an article, but also in a much more expanded format in Kevin Lynch's landmark book, The Image of the City, in 1961. My study had a different goal. I wished to understand, as I mentioned, the perceived and encountered impediments by older people who live in the inner city and walk around their neighborhoods or want to walk around their neighborhoods. And with an eye towards what we should do as planners and urban designers to make these sidewalks more inclusive for older adults. So with my students, we conducted this walkabout of 11 low-income older adults. They all lived in a 200-unit affordable apartment building in Westlake. 7 participants were female, 4 were male, 1 was in her late 60s, 8 were in their 70s, and 2 were in their 80s. 6 were Korean, 4 Latino, 1 American Indian. The weather was sunny and nice, as it usually is in Los Angeles. And for each trip, one older adult was matched with one younger adult, either a student or myself. And we pretty much asked them what Kevin Lynch and Malcolm Rifkin asked. We're about to take a short walk. Please don't look for anything in particular, but tell me about the things you see, hear, or smell, everything and anything you notice. And I would say that this is a very typical block in Los Angeles inner city. The route was 0.4 miles. It took an average of 20 to 25 minutes to complete. We're talking about long blocks in Los Angeles. And here are also some of the questions that we were asking these older adults as we were walking, to prompt them to discuss the things. And after we finished the walk and we came back to their apartment buildings, we also asked a few follow-up questions. What things stood out from the walk, how comfortable they felt, if they usually take precautions to walk in the neighborhood, what would they change if they could? I immediately want to say that walking around the block was not a pleasurable experience for none of these 11 adults. At times, it was uncomfortable and even scary. They talked about a number of environmental impediments that I'm showing in this table in order of commonality of being discussed. They refer to what environmental psychologists talk as setting aggravation, elements that create aggravation like trash, cracked sidewalks, barbed wire fences. I'm going to show you a number of these images, as well as setting deprivation, things that were missing that these older adults wish they were there, like trees or benches or birds. So trash was very prominent, and on the right you see a lot of the comments. Selectively, I have put some comments there. They talk about how the sidewalks are sticky. They talk about dog crap, about how the street was full of food waste. And many of them noticed that there were no trees. Indeed, Westlake, as many other inner city neighborhoods, has a dearth of street trees. Street trees only have an average life in Los Angeles inner city of 5 years. During the walkabouts, the hot weather combined with a lack of shade contributed to uncomfortable and sweaty walks for these adults. Many talked about the cracked sidewalks. Again, you see on the right, on the left, you see the images. On the right, you see the comments. And how uneven, and sometimes someone talked about the shopping cart that gets stuck. They talked about graffiti and barbed wired fences as a dominant image, and nothing, that the whole walk, there is nothing nice to look at. And of course, they talked about no benches. I want to take a rest break on this little wall. You see, there is nowhere for me to sit and take a rest. That was something that was being repeated. Walks were also characterized by social impediments. A lot mentioned about encountering drunk people and signs of drunkenness, as you can see on the left, empty bottles with alcohol, and a number of people talked about people doing drugs, or they mentioned about people sleeping on the sidewalks and older adults having to get onto the street so that they don't bump onto someone who was sleeping on the sidewalk. And of course, some mentioned traffic impediments. They talked about the very wide arterial streets, the intersections, the hassle to cross the street, and many talked about, for many actually, it was the most stressful part of the walk, as they remembered it afterwards, the fact that they were in the middle of the street and the light turned red. And then people started honking their horns and their cars. They talked about fast-moving traffic, about reckless drivers and impatient drivers. And this shows a word cloud about some of the most prominent words that they used. You see trash, shade, and it was the lack of shade that they meant. Cracked, meant cracked sidewalks that were very much in the minds of these older people as they were walking. And they all said that they take precautions and they have to adapt their behavior when walking in their neighborhood as a result of these impediments. Most indicated that they only walk if absolutely necessary to go to the market or to the bus stop or to a medical clinic. Mostly avoid walking for pleasure or exercise. Some reported walking on only within a very narrow spatial range. One Latina woman indicated that she tries to walk only inside her apartment when she wants to walk for physical exercise along the corridors back and forth of her apartment. An Asian woman said that she only walks when she visits her sister that lives in the suburbs. Almost everyone reported avoiding walking at night. And many said that they had to change their routes to avoid passing in front of places and people they deemed as dangerous. So the physical and social landscape of this inner city neighborhood limits the mobility of its older adult residents and takes away their right to the city. The 11 older adults who participated in this walkabout experienced setting aggravation, setting deprivation. Tellingly, no one described their walk as pleasurable, and only a few items emerged as positive. Some of these had to do with a mixed-use environment, the availability of neighborhood retail stores. In general, however, the pleasures of walking were largely absent, and because of these environmental, social, and traffic impediments. In contrast, these elders shaped a deep concern for safety while walking. Their walks encountered a dystopic landscape, broken and uneven sidewalks, graffiti and trash, fast-moving traffic, wide and difficult to cross intersections, and the ever-present signs of homelessness and drunkenness on the sidewalks. This environment denies these older adults their right to the neighborhood, and it has become worse during the COVID-19 pandemic because it added the fear of the disease and which confines a lot of people at home. So what can we do through design? A lot of these issues are structural issues, but I would argue that we can do a lot through design to plan and design for age-friendly streets. And it is a responsibility, if we want to have a just urban design, to create age-friendly cities. A series of simple physical improvements can make sidewalks more inclusive. We are talking about not difficult things. We are talking about more trees and an urban forest and a city that is willing to water these trees and maintain them. I'm talking about shading structures and building awnings that in a hot climate like those in Los Angeles, but even in a climate where there is snow or rain, can help people walk during rainy days. I'm talking about curb ramps, about bus shelters, street and bus stop benches, parklets that may extend seating spaces on the sidewalk, and sidewalk maintenance and upkeep so we don't have these cracked and uneven sidewalks that make people afraid that they're tip and fall. There is a whole literature on traffic calming. I don't plan to go over that, but medians and chicanes, raised pedestrian crossings, and of course, increased traffic signal length could go a long way towards making the streets and sidewalks more age-friendly. And the COVID-19 pandemic has made outdoor public spaces even more important, I would argue, because the spread of disease is significantly lower in the outdoors. But as the most vulnerable age group, older adults need more assurances in order to use public spaces again. We see a number of cities around the nation that have designated open streets, and some places they are called slow streets. But at least the ones that I see in Los Angeles and you see on the right, again, you don't see older people there. And I believe that through certain of the retrofits I've mentioned, the formation of islands on the pavement, seating spaces for older adults, solar reflecting materials, and cool pavements, we can make these places, these slow or open streets, more hospitable. I will finish by saying that, of course, the aforementioned modest design intervention cannot address all the impediments faced by people walking in American inner cities. Social problems such as homelessness, drunkenness, crime, drug dealing represent larger structural issues that hamper the life and well-being of many inner city residents. These require larger and much needed political and financial commitments and interventions that go far beyond the scope of the study. Still, age-friendly design interventions can add comfort, reduce fear, and increase mobility. Designing sidewalks that are inclusive of older adults would bolster their right to the city. So I'm going to stop sharing since I finished my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Anastasia. And thank you particularly for putting a experiential and human sort of component to this. We find that in plans, we might find a whole lot of sidewalk connectivity in the kinds of places that you showed us, but it's the experiential first-hand, sort of accounts that tell us how well these are places that actually serve the needs of walking. Thank you. Our second speaker tonight, Dr. Drusilla Van Hengel, is a senior principal at Nelson Nygaard, a national transportation planning firm that is deeply committed to mobility, accessibility, and sustainability for all. Drew's combined academic, nonprofit, public sector, and consulting experience helps communities make walking and bicycling viable options for people from 1 to 100. Her work takes place at the intersection of transportation and public health, where public and private investments in the built environment have their most immediate impacts on people using the public right of way. Drew's academic background in travel behavior and policy analysis has informed a career focused on how communications campaigns, street design, and operations can equitably support a sustainable transportation future. She has developed safe systems, Vision Zero plans, active transportation plans, and safe routes to school programs in cities across the US, including Detroit, Grand Rapids, LA, and Washington, DC. Drew is a NACTO certified instructor, a cycling instructor with the League of American Bicyclists, and a national Safe Routes to School instructor. Welcome, Drew.
Thank you very much. I think it worked. Thank you to the School of Planning and the Mercantile Library. I'm very pleased to be here tonight. Before I begin, I want to first recognize all the ways my presentation is going to fail. It's going to fail to recognize all the challenges faced by cities because I'm limiting my focus on the ways in which our perspective of Vision Zero and equitable transportation principles have shifted over the last year since the pandemic. I won't be able to fully center on the lived experience of Indigenous and targeted African American and Latinx communities who have historically suffered from transportation decisions, have been exposed to disproportionate traffic violence on our streets, and that these same communities are more at risk to COVID-19 due to compounding systemic inequities. This presentation may also fail in fully acknowledging the pain and suffering of my colleagues across North America who have been working with only a fraction of their teams to meet the challenge of providing unforeseen services to help our long season of recovery. But what I'm going to try to do best is to create a connection between the trends we're seeing by road users and the ways in which cities have and can respond so that they can adapt their transportation systems to both support economic recovery and minimize the rate of ongoing disease transmission through a lens of equitable investments and overall personal and street safety. First, we need to talk about segregation to do that. This map from the Washington Post shows the racial distribution of people living in Cincinnati. The blue dots are representing Black people, and the red dots are representing white people, and that's my cat. However, it's a typical depiction of many urban places where historic underinvestments, overt and subsurface racism, such as redlining, have created cities where Black, Brown, and Indigenous people are physically separated from white people by large roads, rivers, train tracks, highways, and intent. And 1 year into the pandemic, it's clear to most that density and transit aren't causing COVID hotspots. It's the multi-generational racism and its downstream consequences of segregation and inherited poverty that are. So I'm going to take a look at the systems affecting people of color and white people. People of color and poor people are isolated into communities that are underinvested in. And these communities have the following characteristics. They're concentrated, low quality, crowded housing, which makes social distance difficult. There's low access to employment opportunities and poor transportation options that and expensive ones if households choose to invest in single occupant vehicles for those essential and non-essential trips, meaning that essential workers in these communities have to travel further to their jobs and use a public transportation system that may require taking multiple modes of transit, multiple seats to reach their destinations. These concentrated housing, concentrated housing tends to be also located along high volume streets and highways, which present more and severe exposure to crashes. In these neighborhoods, there's also less access to recreation and high quality food. And so they need to leave their neighborhoods to get these things and need to go further if they're not able to bear the cost of delivery. And at each node in this system, the risk of exposure is amplified for people living in these communities, creating a cycle of probability of increased rate of transmission of COVID-19. And that's just the start of it. This doesn't layer on the trauma associated with interpersonal violence, over-policing, immigration, crackdowns. And then layering onto that, these communities tend to be exposed to higher levels of pollutants and have higher rates of chronic disease and poor medical care that correlates with more serious and fatal responses to viruses like COVID-19. And so finally, the jobs that people living in these communities tend to are more concentrated in these communities are essential service jobs, and they by their very nature rely on direct interaction with customers, often within industries that weren't prepared and weren't able to provide the occupational protections needed early on. And and so excuse me, people living in these communities are exposed to so much more than other city residents who are more affluent and white. So let's talk about these neighborhoods, the other colors of the dots on the map. And although, as before, I'm reticent to generalize to full cities and hope you'll indulge me in painting a picture of the extremes, white and affluent city residents have more choice. Our jobs suddenly, although non-essential, came home to us so that we could live at work. Grocery trips to our nearby and accessible high quality shelves can be delivered by a variety of pickup and delivery firms. Peloton and Livestream brings in fitness or higher access, and our higher access to medical professionals gets us COVID testing. And if I'm nervous, I might just choose to leave town altogether. So this pandemic has really kind of created a cycle that we've seen before. Highways in the 1950s and 60s allowed white families to flee integrated cities for new suburbs. Following white families' departures, public and private investments in the cities faltered. Today, the agent of change isn't the interstate highway system, however, but the technological changes and a growing fear with overcrowding and commuting. And the pandemic has accelerated this wave that was maybe already happening in the background, with high costs of urban living and high office and residential prices per square foot. So while companies and workers are rethinking the necessity of expensive office spaces, cities are facing the challenge of how to keep cities competitive. And this generation's our day's white flight must rapidly be countered with high quality investments, the kinds of which Anastasia described, in our equity communities. And some of these investments are rapid transportation changes, high quality transportation and great places, small business support, affordable housing, land trust, and anti-displacement policies to secure housing. And I'm going to focus the remainder of my talk on how to invest in streets and transit in these ways, serving these isolated neighborhoods first in order to support better health outcomes related to traffic crashes, disease prevention, and personal harassment and violence. And although many of these tactics I'm going to show you will look temporary, they are really a quick path forward to investing in the people who stayed. Our streets are emptier than they used to be with the virtual elimination of single occupant vehicle traffic for the journey to the white collar journey to work. And combined with oversized lanes, this is making it hard for drivers to admit the risks associated with speeding, and we're seeing higher speeds, higher red light running, in part because of the antiquated street designs that supported faster travel by cars. And also, we find that this is threatening citywide Vision Zero programs that are focused on eliminating serious and fatal traffic crashes, which have been a priority in the transportation and traffic operations world for about 5 years now. Many cities have taken prompt actions to install planned bikeways with interim roadway treatments that will narrow up travel lanes and separate people on bikes from drivers. Other cities have taken a slow streets approach to reduce through traffic on local streets, both to reduce speeding and open up space for physical activity. And others have made operational changes. And for people focusing in this area, we're saying the pandemic hasn't caused a disruption in the system, it is a part of the system. And if our target with Vision Zero is to eliminate deaths on our streets, we have to start thinking about eliminating deaths due to disease transmission. We have to think more heartfully about eliminating personal violence on the streets as well. And cities have. Transit agencies are implementing virtually heroic practices related to this problem. They're doing more with less. Some of the strategies that are happening on board are contactless or fare-free rides, running only essential and supplemental transit routes to serve people who stayed and who are essential workers, limiting passengers to reduce the risk of transmission, backdoor boarding, real-time communications regarding onboard availability to reduce the delay and the chance of being passed by. But they're also getting more, it's also important to note that that cities are preparing to improve the safety and security of people on our streets with reinforcements and strategies to get more people back on the bus. In 2020, American voters placed their confidence in transit, passing 47 of 53 transit measures that were on various ballots during 2020. And transit agencies are using this trust to develop more reliable and faster service, operating in this example on the right in red bus-only lanes or not red bus-only lanes, depending on the city, giving people more time to spend at home with their families. High-quality bikeways also are a benefit for our transit agencies because they leave more seats on the bus for the long-distance travelers, as people who bike are attracted to bikeways for the short trips. Many cities are taking this time of lower traffic volumes to focus on maintenance of critical assets such as traffic signals and critical repairs. And they're doing this while operating under modified shifts and physical distancing protocols, while also taking advantage of these lower street volumes. And it's again, more heroes on our street, investing in the people who stayed and getting ready for the people to come back. The planning and implementation of the Vision Zero and other quick builds, which I'll show you a few more of later, are undertaken through a new lens of engagement. We're developing new protocols for public meetings, and also standing up the planned networks and unplanned projects that have been planned in the past and we're waiting for this moment. All this with accelerated delivery and in the face of massive furloughs and layoffs. I mentioned bikeways. Pop-up citywide protected bike lanes have been installed in many European cities. And in North American cities in Canada. We haven't seen a citywide install in the United States yet. But the point of these connected and protected bike lanes is to support physical distancing and reduce crash risks due to the aforementioned high-speed differentials with drivers driving more quickly on our streets, but also the differential between people on scooters, e-bikes, and bikes compared to people who are walking. And now is the time to implement adopted plans for protected bike lanes and planned transit investments, using the lower traffic volumes to reconfigure travel lanes into bus or bike only, with the intention to keep them permanently if they perform favorably against adopted transportation values. These treatments can provide direct routes to hospitals and essential business, and when expanded, will support the support the increased ridership, which we've seen over the course of the last year, and which we hope can continue. Another strategy that cities are using is to install temporary walkways and sidewalk extensions in those walkways. Temporary redesigns of sidewalks accommodate more foot traffic, but provide better access to transit, and allow people to feel more safe walking on our sidewalks during these physically distanced days, which sometimes it's hard to see past. Other curb management strategies that cities are using are to work with local and small businesses, in particular in equity-focused communities, to actively curb manage by adding parking or loading zones for school, meal, and restaurant pickup for in November for voting, and right-sizing loading zones to maintain appropriate physical distance for curb access to transit. Some cities are adjusting permitting processes to support enterprise innovations that bring food, childcare, and medical care to people living in targeted communities. We're anticipating the need for public-private partnerships in shared mobility, like e-bike share and scooter share and bike share. In China, there was a 180% surge in bike share ridership as compared to a 50% recovery in bus usage. We think that although it is transit that is serving many of these communities that we're most concerned about, the resources that will be brought to bear to improve transit to a level of service at which everybody is comfortable will take some time. And these public-private partnerships to operate in equity zones and offer complementary or exchangeable trips from the bus is high. We think about the streets as our community's shared assets. The streets are being thought of more and more as a place that is for everyone and not just simply for the people driving along them. Advisory access restrictions have been installed, and I think will continue to be installed to keep local streets slow and safe for walking while maintaining residential and delivery access. And these strategies can be informal, like this one, or installed via permit or proactive installation, such as this map of slow streets in the city of Oakland. The city of Oakland popped up a network of street segments 74 miles to support safe physical activity and create more space for physical distancing. Importantly, what they learned from that project is that they need to pivot. That what works in Black and Brown communities is different than what works in white communities, and the city pivoted or added to their menu of tools for the Slow Streets program a essential places program that focuses on facing down food insecurity and a lack of access to medical sites and COVID testing, because street designs in our equity communities there and everywhere in the United States focus on supporting high speeds and high volumes, and the downstream result of that is high frequency and severe crashes. And this installation here is a great example of an opportunity to provide people access to healthcare and COVID test sites through a pop-up median refuge island, which is described, which Anastasia described in her presentation, but here is depicted by the cones. Importantly, none of these strategies can create equitable transportation without being informed by the lived experience of people that will be affected by them. It's time to invest in Black and Brown lives with transportation and placemaking planning efforts led by them. New York City learned this method lesson, as have other cities, because they used police enforcement strategies to to enforce the barriers through which people driving were not supposed to go, but that didn't create a welcoming environment for all people living in communities where these pop-up installations were. So that strategy, the city learned, and they've moved away from that. Importantly, this description, this photo here in Pittsburgh was informed through small businesses. It's an example of street dining and some loading changes on either side of it. From my point of view, it's going to be essential to retain the claim on the curb lane for these vital marketplace functions. And as cars return to the streets and people become accustomed and supportive of these treatments, they can be converted from temporary to permanent installations, and we see that across the country happening as well. But integral to this change will be ongoing data collection to drive decisions about long-term installations and to advance campaigns and new strategies for these permanent investments. And finally, just leaving on this slide, many of Midwest transportation investments are funded by millage and property taxes, and these are still vital sources and available. And I recommend using them wisely to connect people safely and conveniently with the places that they're longing and needing to go, but also invest in street designs that serve the same number of people in less space, allowing more room to bring places to the people living in segregated areas. Short-term, like mobile food sources, parks, healthcare, mobile health clinics. Bringing places to people living in equity communities can be as important as creating ways for people to get access outside of their communities. And these short-term investments that we saw in cones and paint and bollards, they save money in the long term because the design can be piloted and adjusted much more easily than projects set in concrete. There's much more flexibility in designing them in place than in designing them using traditional methods of paper, pen, or AutoCAD. And so this graphic, in addition to showing like there's more space for food and recreation and health access, it shows how investing in community streets can be done so that the transportation needs of the same number of people can be served in a smaller right-of-way. In this space, where 100 people, in the space that is needed for 100 people on the left on the slide, we can move them into walking, carpooling, biking, and transit, and still have room for to serve the mobility needs of everyone, and still have room for the right size balance of people driving and room left over. Using place-based balancing to re-envision public and abandoned spaces to solve problems defined by community members and businesses who stays is essential to luring investments back into cities. And people living and working in connected places are in a better position to thrive through the pandemic than those isolated places because they have social, economic, and physical connections that put them in close proximity to more resources. We need to invest in policies and places that matter to the people who have stayed in our cities. And this is a way to elevate their chances and the chance to thrive through future investments. And with that, I will close. And I have to find the button. There it is.
Thank you, Drew. Especially thank you for bringing such a wide variety of examples that show us, that there is something positive happening in the transportation world during this not so positive time. So I'd like to start with a few questions, and my first question really is about the context we are in Cincinnati. That Cincinnati, as many such cities in the Midwest and the Northeast, are different from places like, let's say, Phoenix, that are predominantly auto-oriented places that have essentially emerged in an all-auto framework. Cincinnati and similar older cities that were founded, at least in part, in the pre-automobile or early automobile frameworks, these cities are streetcar cities, right? So their structure and bones is built around that, the built fabric that doesn't necessarily have the same populations as they did, but the networks, the fabric is supportive of that because these are streetcar cities. These cities have had high densities, intensities, and wonderful connections in the more than just the core, actually in the streetcar suburbs that are part of the city. And they were, in essence, more equitable and sustainable in terms of their relationship of form and function and the flows. So aside from the time, maybe that's a separate question, that the pandemic gives us an opportunity to look at this in a different way. But aside from the pandemic, with your experience in transportation, what are the low-hanging fruit, policy, design, communications regarding transforming and improving transportation and mobility for older mid-sized cities like Cincinnati?
Well, I can start. I think that, as you mentioned, cities like Cincinnati, and I have to say that I have only visited once, so I cannot claim familiarity, but older cities, streetcar cities, have definitely an advantage because they have a mixed-use environment. The scale of the street versus the surrounding buildings is different than when you have to cross, for example, this very wide arterials that I was showing. So in many ways, you have an easier time converting them into more walkable, more pedestrian-friendly cities. And so I think a lot of the items that I mentioned in my talk, the trees, the benches, the parklets, although parklets in Cincinnati would be only used seasonally, I would imagine. Whatever design means you can do to enhance walking and biking and all the ideas around complete streets and livable streets are easier to accomplish in streetcar cities than they are in cities where we have 100 feet of an arterial and everything designed around the automobile. So it is much more difficult to reclaim cities like Phoenix and Los Angeles than it is cities like Boston or Cincinnati or etc. And so I think that's a big advantage.
I don't disagree at all. I think there is a lot of opportunity in the Midwest. The street, and however, there has been declining populations in many Midwest cities, with which have there are causes and results of those declines. And so the way I think about it from an engagement perspective is that we're not able to jump to the solutions of what street elements are going to be most suitable to invest in, because we really need to invest in the people who are there, who are still there, and ask what is needed, what they need, what they can't get to anymore because of transportation barriers, what networks are broken for them as it relates to the modes that are affordable and accessible to them. And then you have some there to figure out what the solutions or elements should be in your street design. And good news is there are a lot of the streetcar streets, they are sweeping and wide, and they have their space, especially with a decreased population, to reallocate the space accordingly to the ways in which people tell us that will help them to have access to the people and places that they need.
If I may add one thing, and actually Drew talked about public-private partnerships, and I would add a third element, which is community. So public-private community partnerships are very important, and the communities can be different. It could be the communities of bikers in the city, or it could be the communities, I talked on the West Coast, parklets, became quite popular, but they were only designed and developed if there was a community supporting them. So bringing in these different communities is important, and it is something that we are not very familiar oftentimes to do. We're maybe working in the public sector. We have to prepare a plan. At the most, you have a public hearing. Very few people show up, and some of the communities that I'm calling the vulnerable communities will not go to a public hearing, but somehow you really need to incorporate their ideas in the process and design and plan accordingly. And I think we should start adding this third element, public-private community partnerships.
Yeah, that's a great point, Anastasia. And we really try to do that in our work, and by working with local community members or trusted community members to have conversations similar to the ones you had with your walking study, you know, one-on-one with folks, you know, to help understand the problems before we generate the solutions on them. And I would take as an example, you mentioned a bicycle community, but really, you know, we don't want those people at the table. They're going to ride anywhere, right? But we want to know what are the things that are keeping people from riding bicycles? And if it's, you know, I feel threatened because of the color of my skin, or I feel threatened because the traffic speeds are too high. But if it was separated, I would get on my bike. I have one in my garage, or I remember doing that as a child and it was fun. Then we know, okay, well, this is something, and it needs to, bikeways are maybe a thing for this community in a way that they might not be for other communities who need to go so much further and really need better transit access and both getting to transit and the transit, you know, routes.
Mm-hmm. Before I go to a couple of the audience questions, I have one other question, which is a larger question, but perhaps this might be answered in terms of your experience or experience that has been successful. So the question is, of course, how can planners, urban designers, and civic leaders promote a more equitable mobility and transit and for non-motorized modes of transportation that are alternatives for both choice and justice. And we see that very differently in Europe versus here in the US, meaning that transit is not just for the poor, that perception, and that bike lanes are not for, you know, the bike messengers and the cool kids who really treat it like a sport rather than a mode of transportation. So are there ways that you can think that the way equitable mobility is presented is both for choice and justice?
This is a big question, and you know, one kind of ponders where to start. Personally, I would start by making a lot of the modes that are often used by the underprivileged part of the population better. There is a reason why, there are a number of reasons that why people are married to the cars, but one of the reasons is that the alternatives are not as convenient or as well designed. So, you know, I have lived 30 years now in Los Angeles. People who have a car would never use public transit because the way that the buses are scheduled and programmed is that, you know, they're overcrowded. They don't stop. I have done a lot of surveys of bus riders. They don't stop when you're expecting them to stop. They break down sometimes. There are a lot of issues, and the city have often privileged, let's say, the trains and the metro than the buses, where some of the poorer people are the riders. So a lot of these modes are not well, they are not funded well, and as a result, people would not use them if they have the choice. There is this term that we use, captive riders. They're the people who are without cars and they have to use the transit. I wish this was not the case. I was born in Athens and lived there till I came as a graduate student to the US, and I would always either walk around in the city or use buses and trolleys. And a lot of the cities, I have visited Latin America, people use the bus and the trolley. There are issues also of safety and security that a number of people, especially women, would avoid to use the bus and the train, especially in the evening and at night. So I think we really need to give our attention into how we make these modes better. And that would be a big step towards justice, really.
The one example that in India, in Delhi, for example, the transit system is worse. It's overcrowded. The whole infrastructure is not particularly good. But the private sector, very interestingly, runs its own parallel transit. So you have these wonderfully air-conditioned, very comfortable buses that are running on time, and you buy a subscription and you do that. And all you have to be is in the lower middle class to be able to get access to that. And it is an amazingly wonderful system. Of course, populations are, numerous times the cities of the US. So there is a place for every type of mode and the way of providing that. But that's another alternative where people who have cars, they can afford cars, will take those because they are absolutely fantastically comfortable. With the caveat, they're run by the private sector. So is that an alternative?
That, to me, that's only an alternative if the private sector is also franchised to run the highest quality, somehow supports the highest quality service for all.
Yeah, so that it doesn't exclude, exactly, that doesn't. And there are cities, I remember I was in China with my students, and the trains had three options. One was to buy a ticket where you were standing. The other was with the soft seats and the hard seats, and the soft seats were the luxury seats. And my students wanted to get to pay somewhere. We did not want to be standing because it was a relatively long ride. So they said, let's get the hard seats. And I thought, okay, I'm going to get the hard seats too. And they were very nice. Even the hard seats, which were, less expensive, much better than what you often get in other places. And that's a public sector investment.
But with even the hard seats, you get there at the same time.
Exactly.
You still get the reliability, and you know that you're going to be on time 100% of the time instead of 80% of the time. You're on special fixed guideway where you're not stuck in the traffic that everybody else is stuck on. Yeah, it can be very good. That's what we're working for. That's what we're doing now while people are at home. That's the example of the red bus line, for example, in the city of Portland, which is where that picture is taken, but they're no strangers. Most major cities are doing this. They are installing high quality bus access transit lane, bus rapid transit lanes, so that buses can be in their own lane, only them. And then there can be real predictability about the level of service that riders and operators will have, because the lane is excluded from the single occupant and carpool, any vehicles in most cities. Cars, I mean.
And as Drew says, the BRTs, you see a number of cities. Actually, in Ahmedabad, I rode the BMT, a number of Latin American cities. So, it's not like only the very wealthy cities of the world that are developing some of these mass transit modes that are widely accessible, quite inexpensive to larger parts of the population.
I have a question from a former colleague, Conrad Kickert. The question is, in a future with likely budget shortfalls, how can we make systemic, long-term street improvements beyond cones with less public funding?
I would argue through taxation. I mean, we have to. If these are public goods, actually, a colleague of mine, a number of people the name is very familiar, Donald Shoup, has talked about how do we get more street trees, for example. Well, when one sells his or her house, add $500 for a street tree that goes to the city. And he did a study of streets in Los Angeles, and because of quite high turnaround, I mean, these homes are sold quite often. Within a matter of 10 years, the street is full of trees and they are paid for. Or there are a number of, but some public financing and taxation necessary in my view.
Drew, were you?
I mean, I think there's no shortage of creative ideas around how to fund our cities' transportation network. I mean, it's so essential to the success of our cities that transportation works. I was, and ballers are ugly. They're not, but they do achieve the outcome that people are looking for. For example, with protected bike lanes, they're looking for an outcome where they feel safe and separated from traffic. And so with the experience that more users have of being in an environment where they enjoy their transportation, and not only as a means to get someplace else, but maybe because they're enjoying the transportation itself, then the public will for investing increases. So I'm okay with things being ugly for a bit, as we build the coalition and the experience that people are demanding it more.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I have another question, a little different. How do you see transportation technology as an opportunity in transportation equity?
That's an interesting question. Depends on what. So I can think of talking about older adults. There has been a lot of interest about driverless cars. Once someone cannot longer drive, can you have a driverless car? We're talking now about inequities because of age, but other things that may enable micromobility, like the scooters, which are relatively cheap ways to move around, not very long distances. These might be certain things. We're starting a study which is funded by NSF under the civic program that is going to look into community biking. But if these bikers have an app that shows what is the easiest way to, before they start, to navigate based on the traffic and etc. So one can think of different ways that new technologies can help mobility and probably make more equitable. And we're talking about this biking is going to be with low-income bikers in Chinatown. So there are different ways, but it is a big topic, and we have to know better what these technologies are finally going to, materialize some about.
Yeah, and there's so many different technologies, as Anastasia said. There's the information bits. There's also the changing in and out of vehicle technologies, regardless of if we ever get to driverless cars, and we could have a whole long day talking about that. But the reality of those investments that transportation and technology firms are making in cars is that the outsides of cars are safer than they used to be, so that we're not only protecting the occupants inside the car, but also protecting the people who they hit. And either through the things that ping out and come back to tell the car that there is something in front of them, but also cushioning strategies on the outside of the car, so fewer people can be killed when they're hit by cars. So there's so much work going on in this in the transportation technology realm, related to safety, but also related to this question of having surety of when you're going to be able to get on the bus. Advance these apps that transit agencies are developing that say, yep, that bus is now at capacity. Don't go wait for that one. Wait for the next one. Anything we can do to increase the safety and reliability of how we move around in the world, I'm all for.
The next question is from another colleague, Chris Offrey, and it's tied to, I think, this discussion. Early evidence from studies of ride sharing suggests it is substituting for public transit. Can we expect that the expected onslaught of AVs will actually increase traffic congestion?
I have very strong feelings about this. Firstly, it's not ride sharing, it's ride hailing.
Right.
Ride sharing, this thing we used to call carpooling, where we have multiple people in one vehicle and we reduce the number of cars that are needed to move that same number of people. it's and so I would love us to stop calling transportation network companies ride sharing opportunities, because it's not really,
Sharing.
yeah, it's a little upsetting. And my feeling is, yes, we need to design our transportation systems now so that we don't create an induced demand for more that supports more vehicles out there, because ride hailing and driverless cars both give us the threat that we don't no longer need places to park cars, which is kind of nice, except for that means they're moving around our cities all the time, and it makes it more important to design, out some of the inherent threats associated with that. What do you think, Anastasia?
I fully agree. I mean, it would be a dystopic landscape if we have now cars moving constantly around the city, all the time, because I think it is going to increase the traffic. One thing I wanted to mention about technologies, they may have also negative aspects. I mean, a lot of people believe that, and there are some studies about all these apps that show you what's the best way to go to work or to go to your destination. And actually, anecdotally, and I live 27 miles from UCLA. And in these 31 years, I had found the perfect ways that were going through different neighborhoods. And then these apps started coming up. And all of a sudden, the most congested part of my commute are these off neighborhoods because everybody knows now these streets, and the congestion really became even worse in some of the, not on the freeways, but in residential areas. So it's a lot of discussion about how the
sorry to interrupt you, and that also affects our delivery of emergency services.
Another question, more of a comment, I think that's going back to Anastasia, your presentation from Danilo Palazzo. Walking is so undermined and underestimated, especially in North American cities. And Cincinnati is a good example of this. Walkers are looked at with suspicion. I think LA is a good example of that too. We have interesting stories around that. What if we relearn to walk, he asks. What if we put back the walking in urban agendas, starting with group walk, to reestablish confidence in sidewalks and in cities in general?
Yeah. I think that Danilo is absolutely right. And he comes from a place, Italy, very near Greece, where people are walking a lot. And it is very much part of the culture. And as he says, a lot of in North American cities, people are kind of seen with suspicion, but partly also has to do with that there is no infrastructure, a good infrastructure for walking. Now with the pandemic, I see many more people walking and cycling around my neighborhood. I live in Pasadena. It's a suburb of Los Angeles, and people are walking more, but people who live in the areas and the neighborhoods that I showed, and I'm emphasizing, this is not a unique inner city neighborhood. There are a lot of neighborhoods in Los Angeles that are like those that I show. They don't have the basic pedestrian infrastructure. It's even more difficult and dangerous to walk. And it is not only that people do not walk here, but the built environment that we provide is not pedestrian friendly. And that's where I think we really need to act if we want to encourage more people to walk. And I love the idea of the open and slow streets. And I'm hoping that this is a silver lining of the pandemic, that finally people discovered the spaces around their homes as areas where they can walk or cycle. We need to encourage that.
Another question from Ken Stapleton. Great to hear you talking about how personal security means women and others avoid transit, walking, and biking, particularly after dark and in low-income neighborhoods. Are there examples of places that have addressed this equity issue effectively?
I can think of an example. I talked a little bit about the lack of independent mobility of children, especially in inner city areas. Parents are extremely fearful to let them go. And there is an example, I believe it's in Santa Ana, of a neighborhood where the time that the school ends, the parents are committed that they are, whoever are at home, they are in the front yards watching over the kids who are walking. I mean, it requires quite a lot of collective, and this is the community aspect of what I was saying, public-private community partnership. The ideas of, neighborhood watch and how we mobilize community resources to give some feelings of safety. But safety is from crime, safety is from traffic, and safety is from bad infrastructure. So we really need to tackle all three.
Drew?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, these safe passages programs are really nice. These are the programs where people put their eyes on the streets during the pick up and drop off periods, are a really beneficial community program. It's like it's a heavy lift, but it's a grassroots touch. They're normally often organized by like the district attorney's office and like a neighborhood association in partnership. But we have to look at the systems underneath that need, as Anastasia was saying, we need to look at the systems underneath that require us to put adult eyes on the street so our kids feel and are safe walking in between, their homes and schools. And that takes investment. That takes cities leaning into investments in those communities, in lighting. If community members say, I need light, I can't go out feeling safe without light. Well, then I might have come in with a bike plan, but I'm not going to leave with a bike plan. I'm going to come in with some partners to try to structure a project which will address the things that community members need first. So, yeah, I just think these grassroots opportunities to improve safety and improve the walking culture are really important, but they're not it's a complex system.
Next question is from Katerina Villani, and she says, thank you. Can Dr. Loukaitou-Sideris suggest a specific framework or maybe best practices for including vulnerable groups in public hearings, forums, workshops related to pedestrian streets?
I have a very good example that I participated and kind of led. It didn't involve streets, but it involved a park. And it is the Los Angeles State Historic Park near Chinatown that the city created. And it is an area that's surrounded by a lot of minority communities, especially Korean, Chinese, and Spanish. And they wanted to have, these communities participate in the park. And we used the model that the public hearings were not working. They should have had the public hearings in schools and work with PTAs and in community institutions and churches. So that's one way that you really try to work with community institutions. If there is a church that has, here in Los Angeles, there is Catholic church that has every Saturday 5 or 6 masses a day. We have worked with that priest. So you find the community institutions. But in this particular example with the park, we convinced the state parks to hire some women from the neighborhood. You're probably familiar with the promotores model. It is a public health model where you're hiring people from the neighborhood, you train them, you pay them, and they become the ambassadors, if you like. And so the state parks had a number of listening sessions where a lot of people, they were mostly women, brought a lot of their neighbors and friends from the community to talk about what kind of programming they want to see in the park. And state parks listened, and a lot of the programs that they created were in response to, the needs of the community. And I did a before and after survey of how many people were using the park before and how many after, and you see an increase, significant increase. So there are ways, work through the community institutions, try to hire people from the community in order to get, their voices heard.
Right.
Yeah,
And then to enable that, I'm just going to pile on, I'm sorry, but to enable that, we need new structures of financing in some ways. Like it can be very difficult to compensate community members directly through some of our transportation funding sources. And so it's really important to couple up these kind of traditional sources, whether they're city operations or capital funds or grants, with more innovative sources that allow to pay community members who don't carry these, liability indemnification. They don't have like what we typically need as we contract with people to do engagement to like close up the little risk, the risk requirements that come along with a lot of our contracts. So I would advocate, in addition to what Anastasia described, like carefully cultivating the funding sources so that you can pay local community members to inform and design with you.
great point. After all, I mean, that information and that knowledge is priceless for what you're doing. We have a couple minutes, and I'm just going to pick up on a question that's kind of obvious. Drew showed us, through a presentation, the kind of silver lining that might be there, and then Anastasia just talked about it. With all the changes during the pandemic that we are seeing, very positive changes for the most part. What is your sense as things return? I know we are optimistic that some of these things should hold and change, sort of street networks, the whole transportation network itself. But what are your optimistic yet realistic predictions about how this would play out?
Well, we have to put our crystal ball.
Yes.
I learned mine was broken about a year ago for a second time in my life. I'm very optimistic. I think that we're at the intersection of a lot of really important American moments, and I'm optimistic because I'm ready to act in a way in my discipline and my profession that I have not been able to up to this point. And I think there are many people like me in the transportation planning, operations, capital project development and design who are like knowing that this is our moment, and we're not going to let history repeat itself.
And I'm optimistic as well because I see it also through the eyes of a lot of young kids, the students that we're educating, and you see that it is a real thirst that this is our moment. We really need to do better. And these are, the planners and the designers that are going to have, they're the future of our cities. And I have sensed this last year a major commitment among a lot of these young people that we should do better. And so I'm also hopeful. And I think that some of the good examples that we mentioned with cities opening up the streets, of emphasizing walking, I think our moral obligation is to always keep looking for the people who are invisible. In my presentation, it was the older adults, but there are so many people who are invisible from, gender-wise, sexual orientation-wise, race, ethnicity, disability. There are all these people that usually are not represented. And if we really want to plan and design in a different way, we have to really listen to their voices.
Thank you. Thank you, Anastasia and Drew. It was wonderful to have you share your perspectives. Wonderful to leave on an optimistic note from both of you. And thank you, viewers, for joining us and for your questions. We hope to see you back next month on February 24th, when my colleague, Dr. Chris Offrey from the School of Planning, will host the next conversation with thought leaders on the living city. So be sure to check out the other interesting conversations at www.thecaseforcities.org. And in the meantime, please also check out the conversations by the Urban Consulate that focus on urban issues and opportunities, specifically racial, class, and gender equity. Their next conversation on protest and public space will be on February 8th at 7 p.m. You can find them through the library or at www.urbanconsulate.com. In closing, I'd like to thank my colleagues at the School of Planning and the University of Cincinnati, the Mercantile Library, the Hale Foundation, and the Orville Simpson Center for Urban Futures for their support. And I want to especially thank Amy Hunter, who has been making sure that our crowdcast experience has run smoothly. The recording of this conversation will be on the website very soon. Thank you and goodbye till we see you on February 24th.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.